My name is Loretta Jean Carter and I am 68 years old. On the morning they lowered my husband into that polished cherry box, my son Marcus pressed the lid until it clicked like a final lock and the whole sanctuary breathed out a soft amen while the choir let the last chord fade into air that smelled of lilies, lemon oil and old hymnals. I should have been praying. Instead my fingers hunted through my purse as if a small trapped bird were beating there. Because something inside me knew before my mind did that a boundary between life and death was about to tear. The pastor closed his Bible with a careful motion. Sister Bernice reached for my elbow. Denise stood on my left with a crumpled tissue and a whisper of "Mama, I am here." Marcus kept his eyes on the coffin like a guard posting himself at a door no one else could see. The phone buzzed again. A small steady insistence. I lifted it and the screen woke with a thin light that cut through the pew shadows and I saw the words that froze my breath where it sat heavy and terrified in my chest. "Help me, Mom." 3 small words, bright on glass. Cruel as a bell in fog. I forgot to breathe, my throat closed, my eyes filled. The room tilted as if the floor under my heels had shifted a fraction to the left. I looked up at Marcus. His jaw was hard. His tie lay neat against a shirt I had ironed for him when he was a boy and still believed I knew how to make the world safe. His face did not change. Another message arrived before I could make a prayer out of the first. "Do not make a scene. I am alive, trust no one." The lid clicked again in my memory. The sound repeated itself inside my head like a metronome that kept time with a fear I did not yet dare to name. I closed my eyes for a heartbeat and in that breath I could smell the way Ernest used to smell when he came home from late shift and laid his hat on the hook and kissed my forehead. Coffee and winter air and the faintest touch of his old cologne that made me think of brown sugar and clean cotton. He had taught me the difference between panic and warning, between noise and signal, between the scream of grief and the whisper of danger. And the words on my screen were not grief. They were signal. I tucked the phone back into my purse and folded both hands on the smooth rail of the pew. I kept my face arranged like a woman trying to hold a hymn inside her mouth, because everybody in that room knew me and I would not give gossips the image of a widow breaking open like a dropped jar. The pastor began the committal. Earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. His voice rolled gently from the pulpit and met the low hum of the air conditioner and the quiet shuffle of shoes, and somewhere a child coughed and was hushed. I kept seeing the words. I kept feeling the faint vibration travel from my palm to my wrist to the place under my ribs where a mother keeps alarm and love stored side by side. Sister Bernice squeezed my elbow and said, "The Lord comforts the broken-hearted." I nodded. Broken-hearted I could live with, deceived I could not. Marcus stepped forward to guide me toward the aisle. People reached for my hands. Casseroles and cards would follow. I have lived long enough to know how community wraps a widow in food and scripture. But the message had changed the size of the room. The wooden beams above me felt heavy as if truth had hooked itself there and was waiting to drop. I caught a corner of Marcus' gaze. There was calculation in it, a brightness too clean for morning, a watchfulness that did not look like care. My stomach went cold as a sink of water left under a slow faucet. I whispered a single question without moving my lips. "Who are you?" The phone answered without mercy. "They are watching." They. The word slid like a blade behind my ears. I thought of insurance forms on the kitchen table. I thought of Marcus' voice last week saying, "Mom, we will take care of everything, just sign here, please trust me." Denise touched my shoulder. Her hand trembled. Her eyes were red in the honest way tears mark a face when love is doing the crying. She mouthed, "Are you all right?" I gave her the smallest nod I could make and still be seen. The pallbearers lifted. The coffin moved. Wood and brass and finality. The organist found a slow chord like a tide pulling out. I stood because the body stands when it must, not because strength lives there. My knees wobbled. The phone pressed a rectangle of heat against my palm. I imagined it branding a single word into my skin. Alive. The procession formed, we walked. Perfumes mixed with the musk of wool coats. Whispers made a kind of weaving over the aisle while old friends spoke the language of grief, which is touch first, words later. At the doors the light widened. Outside the sky held that pale winter blue that looks almost fragile. The wind lifted the edges of my black hat and sent a ribbon against my cheek. At the graveside the ground was already open. A slice of earth dark and careful. The men from the funeral home moved with the quiet skill of people who practice respect for a living. I wanted to shout. The urge rose like a wave. I tasted metal. But the message told me to act normal. So I smiled at the pastor and thanked him for his words. I shook hands with deacons. I kissed a baby someone pushed toward me as if new life might steady old pain. I stood at the head of the grave and watched Marcus stand opposite me with a face that had learned how to be unreadable. The phone buzzed once more. A single pulse. I lifted it near my coat pocket and let my eyes fall as if I were studying the stitching. The new line sat there with a calm that felt cruel. He did this. My heart stumbled. A sound left my mouth so small that only I could hear it. I felt my throat beg for water. I looked at my son, the boy who once clung to my nightgown when thunder rolled down Peachtree Street. The man who now kept his hands clasped like a banker waiting for a signature. The pastor nodded for final words. I stepped forward because a wife must speak even when the ground beneath her is not steady. I thanked the Lord for earnest life and for the mercy that carried us through lean years and storms. While I spoke, my phone vibrated in a rhythm that began to feel like code. I kept my eyes on the grave while my mind counted seconds. Then I knew I could not keep standing at the edge of a hole with questions larger than the sky above it. I said amen, the crowd murmured. Dirt fell in a soft drumbeat. I tasted grit on my tongue. Then I took a breath like a swimmer does before the river turns. I put my arm through Denise's arm. I let Marcus offer the other without looking into his face. I told everyone God is good, and I told myself truth is better. The ride back to the church hall would bring coffee and pound cake and talk about earnest jokes and the time he fixed a neighbor radiator with a spoon. I would listen, I would nod. I would hold my grief like a book that must be read to the end because love wrote it. But I also made a quiet covenant with the woman inside me who has survived births and bills and one winter that took our roof. I would not let questions grow mold in the dark. I would not let fear decide what a mother can handle. The phone buzzed yet again as if to seal our agreement. My palm tingled. I checked the screen while the hearse door shut with a respectful thump. Go home alone. Lock the door. Check the desk. A map more than a message. A command more than a comfort. I did not know who was speaking from the thin country between now and gone. I only knew that my spirit recognized the timbre of the warning the way a woman recognizes a storm by the feel of the air in her bones. I lifted my head and put on my best church smile. I told Sister Bernice I would see her at the repast. I told the deacons to save me a plate. I told the usher boys thank you baby for your fine service. Then I walked very slowly to the car because haste is a language fear speaks and I wanted the world to hear faith in my steps. Marcus reached the passenger door before I did. He held it and said softly, I will drive you home, Mom. I said thank you, son, and let the words sit there like a coin on a table while my mind weighed their shine against their worth. Denise touched my back. I felt the plea in her fingertips. We will come by after the repast, Mama, and sit with you. I said yes because love must be allowed to try even when suspicion has already unpacked its suitcase in your living room. The engine hummed. We pulled away from the green awning and the neat rows of stones. Marcus watched the mirrors more than the road. I watched his hands and thought of those same hands holding frogs with his father at Baker Park and later holding pens over numbers that did not add up for any purpose I could bless. He asked, are you all right? I said I am held. He said by what? I said by truth and the Lord. He did not answer. At a light he put his hand over mine. The gesture looked tender. It felt like a question mark lying down. He said we will handle the paperwork and the insurance and anything difficult. You do not need to worry about a thing. Rest is holy. Let us be the ones who carry the heavy parts now. I said I will read everything. My voice surprised both of us with how steady it sounded. He smiled a smile that did not quite reach his eyes and said, of course, Mom, you know I would never hide anything from you. The phone in my lap vibrated. I tilted the screen just enough. A single sentence appeared with the quiet of a blade sliding under thread. Do not drink what he offers. The light changed, we rolled forward. I thought of the pitcher of sweet tea on my counter and the way Marcus liked to doctor it with lemon. I thought of the word doctor and how it can mean heal and it can mean alter. We reached my driveway. The porch still wore the wreath Denise had made and the rocking chair still held the cushion Ernest favored on warm nights. The afternoon had begun to sharpen into evening. Shadows lengthened along the walkway like arms reaching for a story. I told Marcus I wanted a minute alone with the house. He hesitated just a fraction then nodded. I told him to bring Denise later and that I would put on coffee. I watched his eyes slide briefly to the kitchen window as if he could see the counter where cups waited. He kissed my cheek. His lips were dry. He said, love you, Mom. I said, love you, baby, and stood there until his car turned the corner and the tail lights slipped out of sight. The key felt heavier than usual in the lock. The door opened with its familiar sigh. The quiet inside my house was the kind of quiet that listens back. I closed the door and stood with my hand on the knob until the echo of the latch had finished speaking. Then I took the phone from my purse and whispered without thinking, "I am home." The reply landed before the fear could climb. "Check his desk, top right drawer, blue notebook, do not call anyone, do not answer the door." I said a verse under my breath, though I could not tell you later which one. I walked down the hallway where our photographs hang like small windows. Ernest's smile followed me in every frame. It steadied my feet. In the study the air still held his scent. Paper and cedar and the ghost of pipe tobacco from years ago. The desk waited with its neat stacks like a man sitting up straight in church. I pulled the top right drawer and saw it at once. A blue notebook with a rubber band around it. The band had a kink as if it had been removed and replaced more than once in a hurry. I set the notebook on the blotter and put both palms flat on either side of it as if I were about to pray. Somewhere outside a car door shut. Somewhere a dog barked and then decided this was not its business. I took a breath that reached my heels. I opened the book. I saw dates and numbers and names and the careful hand of a man who knew that truth must be written down if it is to survive a storm. The first line said in a quiet, patient script, "Loretta, if you are reading this, something is wrong." I grew up believing love was something you could feel in the bones before you ever had words for it. And when I first met Ernest I was 20 years old with hair pressed smooth on Saturday nights and a borrowed dress the color of summer greens. And he tipped his cap at me outside the corner store on Auburn Avenue and said, "Afternoon, ma'am," in that careful way decent men used to speak when they wanted you to know they had been raised right. His hands smelled like motor oil and fresh soap, a mixture that told me he worked hard and washed clean before he came near a woman. And that was the first note in the song that later became our life. We were married on a July afternoon thick with heat and thunder rumbling like far-off trains. And we walked down the steps of the church to a line of aunties waving paper fans with the face of our pastor on one side and a verse about love on the other. And cousins hollered and somebody beat a tambourine off rhythm and nobody cared because joy has its own timing. And we ate fried chicken and potato salad on paper plates, and I remember how Ernest looked at me from across the fellowship hall while he tried to fix a fan that kept rattling loose from the ceiling. The way a man looks when he knows he has been given a treasure he intends to guard with his life. Our first place was not much, 2 rooms and a porch deep enough for 2 chairs. But it was ours and I painted the cabinets butter yellow while Ernest tightened every screw in the floorboards so the house would not complain when we danced slow on Friday nights. And sometimes we would sit on the steps and watch lightning bugs stitch little gold needles through the air, and he would say, "Listen now," and the crickets would answer as if they belonged to him. When Marcus came along I learned what it means to have your heart live outside your body. He was born loud and healthy, and when the nurse laid him on my chest Ernest cried. Not the kind of tears men hide or swallow, but the good kind that wash a man clean of pride. And he held my face and said, "We are going to do this right, Loretta. We are going to raise him to know the difference between honest work and easy money." 2 years later Denise arrived gentle as a breeze and made our house even brighter. And I would watch Ernest hold her with those same careful hands he used on engines and door hinges. And I knew there was a holiness in the way a father loves a daughter that no sermon had ever preached to me. We raised those children in church and at ball fields and beside a sink full of suds and conversation. We believed in grace and in chores and in telling the whole truth even when your voice shook. And we made it through lean winters by counting blessings out loud while beans simmered and cornbread baked. And when the roof leaked we set pots under the drips and laughed like people who refused to be ruined by weather. Ernest worked with his hands until his back started talking to him in a voice we could not ignore. Retirement came not as victory but as a necessary rest. And he took to fixing things for neighbors out of our garage for little money and a lot of gratitude. And every so often a shoebox of small bills would appear under the bed because men like him never quite stop providing even when the calendar says they can. Marcus watched us and learned lessons we did not know we were teaching and also some we never wanted him to learn. He noticed the way money eases worry and he noticed how often it was missing. And he grew impatient with the slow dignity of honest work, asking questions like, "Why do we still live in this house when other people have new kitchens and 2-car garages?" And Ernest would say, "Because we pay for what we have and we do not mortgage our peace." And Marcus would look past him like a boy, already measuring himself against a different yardstick. Denise inherited more of my quiet, more of my habit of listening first, and she loved home like a garden loves its soil. She did not mind hand-me-down dresses if they fit her spirit. And she saved her money in jars labeled for things that mattered to her like school and a trip to the coast to see pelicans lift off the water at dawn. By the time Marcus was a teenager he had a gift for talking himself into rooms and out of trouble. And while I thanked the Lord for his cleverness I worried about the way he could slip a truth into a shape that served him. And Ernest would sit with him at the table and say, "Son, your tongue is a tool that can heal or cut." And Marcus would grin and promise to use it right. And then later I would find a note in earnest hand on the fridge that said, "Watch the boy and pray without ceasing." The years pressed on us in the steady way years do. Funerals and baptisms and mortgages and small celebrations plotted tiny marks on the calendar of our life. And though we never became rich, we had what we needed and a little more most months. And on Sundays I would lay out a roast if we could afford it and make a pie if we could not, because sugar and crust can often fill the space meat leaves empty. And the table would gather us and hold us together like a quiet covenant. The first hairline crack did not look like danger. It looked like success. Marcus got a job in real estate and came home with shiny shoes and a smile that sat more on his teeth than in his eyes. And he hugged me and called me mama in a tone that sounded like a man practicing charm on a mirror. He told Ernest that Atlanta was growing and that houses were gold if you knew where to stand and when to speak. And Ernest listened because he loved his son, and also because he wanted to believe the road had widened for the child he had once carried on his shoulders. For a while the pride tasted sweet. Marcus took us to dinner at a place with white tablecloths and a waiter who whispered and set plates down like he was placing porcelain on clouds. And he said, "This is what you deserve, mama. This is how you should live." And I smiled and said, "Baby, I am content where I am." And Ernest squeezed my knee under the table and nodded because contentment had been our banner and our shelter. Then small things began to go missing from the house, not objects but habits. Marcus' visits shortened and his calls turned into quick check-ins on the way to deals. He stopped asking his father advice and started telling him what was what. He began to say things like equity and portfolio and leverage in a tone that made my kitchen sound like a boardroom. And when Ernest reminded him that character is a currency you spend for life, Marcus laughed in a way that made me want to wash those words and hang them in the sun to dry. One afternoon Marcus laid glossy brochures on our table and said, "If you sell this house now, you could move into a new build with no maintenance and better safety." And he circled numbers and spoke of monthly payments like he was describing lemonade on a hot day. And Ernest shook his head and said, "This house is paid for and therefore priceless." And Marcus' lips tightened around a smile he could not keep from leaking impatience at the edges. Denise watched all this with a face that learned to look down at her hands when she wanted to speak but chose not to. And later she would help me water the azaleas and say, "Mama, do not let him talk you out of what you know." And I would say, "Baby, he is only trying to help." And she would say, "Help that erases your name off your own deed is not help at all." I remember the first time the word insurance arrived at our table like an uninvited guest. Marcus said, "Daddy, you are not as strong as you used to be and life is full of sharp corners. This policy would make sure Mama is taken care of if anything happens." And he slid a packet across the wood and patted it as if it were a sleeping cat. And Ernest looked at me, then back at him, and said, "We have policies enough for a funeral and a little cushion, and we have savings and a church that will not let your mother go hungry." And Marcus said, "This is different, this is responsible." And Ernest said, "Responsible also means reading every line twice and asking who benefits and when." He took the papers to his desk and he did what he always did. He wrote questions in the margin and asked for time. And that night we sat on the porch and he said, "There is a smell to certain kinds of deals, Loretta, and this one smells like perfume on a shirt that has no business wearing it." And I laughed even as fear pricked behind my eyes because I knew exactly what he meant. The next weeks tasted like worry. Marcus kept returning to the policy the way a tongue returns to a chipped tooth. He called and he visited with a briefcase and a line of talk about protecting me. And he said, "Dad, if you love her, you will make sure she is not left with a mess." And Ernest said, "Love does not sign away wisdom." And then he asked for Denise to bring over her friend from legal aid to give a second look. And Marcus said that is not necessary and frowned in a way that made his handsome face look suddenly older around the mouth. I began to notice other things then. Receipts that did not match the stories he told about where he had been. New watches that did not belong on a man still paying off a car. A phone call I overheard where his voice dropped and he said, "I will get it done, quit calling me." And when he caught me looking, he smiled and changed the subject to a movie he thought I would like and asked if I wanted extra butter on my popcorn the next time he took me out. And I pretended not to notice the switch because a mother sometimes holds the door of denial closed for one more hour when she is not ready to step into new weather. Denise visited on a Sunday and found me ironing Ernest's shirts, though he no longer needed pressed collars every day. I told her worry needs something to do with its hands or it will claw at your mind. And she hugged me and said, "Mama, tell me straight, are you scared of my brother?" And I said, "No, I am scared of what he is listening to when he is alone with his choices." Ernest grew quiet in the week before he died. Not sulking quiet but measuring quiet. The kind that happens when a man stacks truths beside each other and waits to see what shape they make. He spent longer in the garage and I heard a pen scratching after midnight and I knew he was putting his mind on paper the way men like him secure their houses with locks and lights. And when I asked what he was doing, he kissed my forehead and said, making sure you will not be bullied by confusion if I am not here to answer every knock. On our last good morning, he brought me coffee the way he always did and stood at the window and watched the street as if it could reveal a secret if he waited politely. And he said, Loretta, if something happens to me, do not rush anything, do not sign anything, do not let anyone decide you are too tired to read. And I told him to quit that talk because it sounded like the beginning of a storm. And he said storms do not begin when clouds show up, they begin when the air changes and people pretend not to feel it. That was the last time I saw him whole and upright and holding the day like a friend. And I remember it not with the heat of tragedy but with the clarity of a bell struck clean. I can still hear the cup set gently in the sink. I can still see the way his fingers rested on the counter 3 beats longer than usual, as if taking a photograph of the room to carry with him. When the call came later, I believed what I was told because a wife believes what her household tells her until truth shows her otherwise. They said it was sudden and merciful and that he did not suffer. And I leaned into that story because grief prefers clean lines. And Marcus arrived with a folder and spoke in a calm voice and said, Mama, I will handle what needs handling. And he put a pen in my hand and used the word trust more times than a person uses a word when they are not measuring it. Wait. Denise drove in from out of town and cried in a way that made the air feel honest again. And she sat with me and rubbed my back and let me talk in circles because circles are sometimes the only path a heart can manage when it has been knocked off its feet. And I told her I could smell Ernest in the hallway late at night, and she said, Mama, love leaves traces even when a body is gone. And I slept a little with my hand on my phone, as if I were waiting to be woken by something more reliable than dreams. If you ask me where the decay began, I will tell you it began in small permissions we gave to worry and to wanting the easier path. It began when Marcus stopped sitting on the porch long enough to remember who raised him, and when we let the language of business trample the language of family, and when a pen moved across paper while a mother was still trying to swallow the word widow, and when people who should have protected our house left the front door open to strangers named urgency and opportunity. Yet even in the middle of that slow unraveling there was love. And it is important I say that, because without love none of this hurts as much as it does. And without love I would not still be here telling you about the smell of lilies the morning my phone buzzed and the coffin clicked and my world tried to split in two. Because love is the thread that made our life, and it is also the thread that will stitch me back together once I have followed it through every knot it now hides. I stood alone in the study with the blue notebook open like a small door into Ernest's mind. And every line felt like a hand held out to me across a distance I could cross only by reading. The first page carried dates and notes about conversations with Marcus. Calm handwriting that never accused yet circled the same words again and again: policy, beneficiary, writer, signature. Beneath a Tuesday date he had written, Marcus brought forms again. Says it is for Loretta if a storm comes, but the numbers are too sweet, and sweet can cover rot. Ask more questions. A later entry said Denise called, told her I am feeling watched when I say no. On the margin he had drawn a small box and inside it wrote, do not sign if you are tired. I traced those words with my finger and felt the same quiet steel that used to live in his voice when he said, Loretta, slow down and look twice. Then look a third time with the Lord. I flipped to the next pages and found a list of accounts and small cash stashes, honest things a man records so his wife will not be left guessing, and then a section titled Things That Do Not Add Up. There he copied a policy number and a phone extension and a note that read, the agent kept saying hurry. Another line said, new pills Marcus brought made me cloudy, stop taking, feel clearer. At the bottom he had underlined 3 words, watch the tea. The words hit me hard enough that I had to sit down, because I could see the glass pitcher on my counter, and the sliced lemons that made a pretty float, and I could hear Marcus' voice telling me sweetness calms the nerves. My phone vibrated in my pocket like a moth trying to escape a lamp, and I lifted it and read another instruction that felt both strange and familiar. Photograph everything and then put it back as you found it. I took pictures of each page, careful, steady, pretending my hands were earnest hands, and when I finished the phone offered one more line. Go to the bank and ask for printed statements. Do not let Marcus know. The clock in the hallway clicked through a minute that sounded longer than it should, and I closed the notebook and eased it back into the drawer and pulled the drawer shut until it settled without a sound. I called Denise and said, baby, I need a ride to the bank, do not tell your brother. And she did not ask why, she only said I will be there in 10. While I waited I walked through the kitchen and turned the pitcher of tea down the drain with a steady hand, and then washed the sink with hot water until the air smelled like steel and steam. Denise arrived with her keys in her fist and her mouth a straight line that said she had decided not to question me until I gave her reason to. We drove in a silence that felt like cloth pulled tight over a secret, and when we reached the bank the guard at the door tipped his head to me the way men do when they have known your family for years. Inside the air held that cool scent of paper and toner and something faintly metallic, and Mrs. Thompson, who had watched us deposit birthday money and Christmas bonuses for a lifetime, stepped from her desk and took both my hands as if grief were a guest she had been expecting. She said, "Loretta, I am so sorry for your loss," and I said thank you and asked if we could sit somewhere quiet. And she led us to a small glass-walled room that pretended to be private. I asked for printed statements from earnest accounts and for a copy of any recent changes to beneficiaries or contact addresses, and she raised an eyebrow because she knew my habits, and I saw her measure my face the way a nurse measures a pulse, and then she said of course and left us with soft chairs and a tissue box. While she was gone, Denise whispered, "Mama, are we in trouble?" And I said, "We are in a truth that has not finished introducing itself." Mrs. Thompson returned with a stack of paper neat enough to calm a hurricane and set it in front of me with a pen and a small silver paperweight the shape of a peach. The first pages showed small deposits and a slow, honest river of bills paid. Then a new pattern, withdrawals in round numbers on 3 Fridays, cash that did not match our life. Next came a document that made my skin prickle. A change of mailing address for policy notices to a post office box I did not recognize, signed with Ernest's name in a line that looked like his writing had been told to hurry. Mrs. Thompson said this struck me as unusual, but it came in with a notarized stamp and a phone confirmation on file, and I said whose voice confirmed, and she read a note that said adult male calling as authorized contact, and my stomach turned because that could be any man, but I heard Marcus cadence in the way the words sat on the page. Denise covered her mouth with her hand and said softly, "Mama," and we sat there while the room felt smaller and the walls more glass than privacy. I asked for surveillance footage on the days of the cash withdrawals, and Mrs. Thompson could not promise, but she made a call and asked and then told us to come back tomorrow morning because the manager with the key would be in then. I thanked her and stood and then decided to ask one more question that had been waiting behind my teeth. "Has anyone asked about the contents of my safe deposit box?" And she checked and said there had been an inquiry but no access without my key, and I told her I would like to visit it next. In that cool, quiet room with metal drawers like a honeycomb built for secrets, I opened the little safe and found a ring box, our insurance policies, a small envelope with earnest handwriting that said for Loretta in case, and I tucked that envelope into my purse with a prayer that asked permission I knew he would have granted. Denise and I stepped out into the bright noon, and she squinted at the sun as if it were an interrogator and said, "Mama, I want to read that letter with you." And I said, "You will sit beside me and we will let his voice be our map." At home I locked the door because the message had told me to, and we sat at the kitchen table where so many bills had been blessed and so many worries turned into meals, and I opened the envelope and unfolded a single sheet of paper that wore the careful pen strokes of a man who had always believed in legibility. He wrote, "Loretta, if you are holding this, I am either unable to explain or already gone, and there are things I need you to know. Marcus has been pushing a policy with a face value that makes no sense for our needs. He insists this is protection for you, but numbers this big can tempt a soul that is already restless. I have refused to sign twice." And then he brought me vitamins for memory and energy, and after 2 days I felt slow and wrong. I stopped and felt clear again. Today he suggested I let him handle the tea while I rest. I told him no, and he smiled a smile that did not rise to his eyes. This is the kind of smile I have seen on men when they are about to choose convenience over conscience. "If anything happens to me, do not let grief make you obedient. Ask for an autopsy, call a lawyer, and check the post office box on Memorial Drive." I believe he set it up to reroute notices. "Tell Denise everything. She sees you in ways I sometimes miss, and remember that love is not blindness. It is courage that keeps its eyes open." I pressed the letter to my chest because a body sometimes needs paper to stand in for a hand on the back, and Denise cried the kind of tears that clear a face without swelling it, and she said, "Mama, we go to the police now," and I said we go with something they can hold. My phone buzzed, and this time I did not startle, I just looked, and the line said, "Call Harper Wells, legal aid, she has copies," and a number followed, a number I recognized in a soft way because Harper had helped a neighbor after a landlord tried to cheat her out of a deposit. I dialed and Harper answered in a voice that did not waste words. And when I said my name there was a pause that held both surprise and purpose. She said, "Loretta, I have a sealed packet in my drawer that Ernest asked me to keep if anything seemed off. Can you come by?" Denise drove while I spoke, and the city slid by with its murals and bus stops and small shops that have been there long enough to become landmarks, and the air in the car felt like the inside of a held breath. At the office, Harper met us at the door in a navy dress and flat shoes that said she liked walking more than waiting, And she took us to a conference room with a scratch table and a pot of coffee and a window that looked toward a strip of sky. She set a brown envelope on the table and said I did not open it because he told me it was for you. But he came to me 2 weeks ago and said he feared pressure and wanted a record somewhere his son could not reach. I broke the seal and slid out a stack, copies of emails, a list of phone numbers, and a flash drive taped to an index card with the words "Play this if I am not there to tell you." Harper plugged the drive into a small laptop and clicked a file, and Ernest's voice filled the room, steady, careful, like a man building a bridge one plank at a time. He spoke of the policy pitch, of the vitamins, of the sudden cloudiness that lifted when he stopped, of a conversation where Marcus said Mama will be fine, you know she trusts me, and of a visit where Marcus stood too close to the tea pitcher. Then came a part that hollowed me out. Ernest had recorded a short exchange in the garage with his phone in his shirt pocket. Marcus' voice asked about signing and about what would happen if an accident occurred. And Ernest said accidents do not begin by themselves, and Marcus laughed in a way that did not belong to the boy I raised. When the audio ended, Harper rested her hand on the table and said this is not proof of a crime, but it is enough for questions with badges. And she asked if we had reached out to the police, and I told her not yet, and she said we will go together as soon as we gather the bank records and the policy documents. Denise leaned forward and said Mama emptied the tea, and Harper nodded and said good, and then asked if Ernest had seen a doctor recently, and I told her he had a blood pressure check the week before and was fine. And she wrote that down with the tidy habit of someone who knows details are a shield. Before we left, she printed a letter for the insurer requesting a freeze on any payout pending review due to potential fraud. And she asked me to sign and said she would fax it and email it and call. And for the first time that day I felt the ground under me firm a little, because action is a kind of prayer too. On the way home, Denise said, Mama, do you think the messages are from Daddy? And I said I do not know how heaven works with phones, but I know his caution, and whatever hand sends them has his mind. When we reached the house, the sunlight had softened into the kind that makes dust look like gold confetti, and I went back to the study and took more pictures and wrote down the policy numbers, and then I did something I have learned to do only after 68 years. I sat still and listened to the room until it told me whether I had missed anything. That was when I noticed a faint line of scuff marks along the baseboard near the desk where a small safe sat tucked behind a false panel Ernest once built for holiday cash, and the panel had a tiny nick that was not there last spring. And heat climbed the back of my neck because someone had known where to press. I checked the safe and found nothing missing, which told me that either someone failed to open it or their interest was not the family jewelry or the old coins. Then I saw on the desk blotter a faint ring of moisture the size of a glass, not my cup, not Ernest's mug, and I had not poured anything since the funeral, which meant someone had been in this room after. Denise called from the kitchen to say Marcus was on his way with dinner, and my heart stuttered because the message about not drinking what he offered rose like a buoy under a dark wave. And I told her to tell him I was resting and would see him tomorrow. And she said, Mama, he says he is already on the street. And I said, then put the chain on the door and we will talk through the wood if we must. Marcus knocked with that 3-beat rhythm he used as a boy when he wanted me to open quickly. And Denise stood in the hall and called, We are resting, Marcus. Thank you for bringing food. Leave it on the porch, and he said let me at least put it in the fridge, and I said through the door, no thank you son, we have it, and there was a long quiet that did not sound like acceptance. He asked if I needed him to go through the mail, and I said not tonight, and he asked if I had spoken with the insurance company because they needed information, and I said all matters will be handled in their time, and he said Mama, you are making this hard, and I said some things should be hard or people will do them without thinking. After he left, Denise looked at me like a woman measuring her mother for the first time, not as a tender figure but as a survivor. And she said, I am glad you set that boundary. And I said, I am glad you stood there to witness it. That night I slept in Ernest's chair in the study because the room felt like a church inside the house. And sometime after midnight my phone lit without buzzing and a new message appeared, simple as sunrise. Go to the post office box at 9 sharp, bring Denise, do not tell a soul. In the morning I dressed in my plainest clothes and tied a scarf over my hair and carried a tote bag that used to hold hymnals, and we drove to Memorial Drive where the post office sits between a beauty supply and a tax service shop, and the air inside tasted like tape and dust and ink and 100 quiet transactions. I handed my identification to a clerk whose badge said Earl and asked to inspect a box registered in Ernest's name, and he asked for the key and for the registration card, and when I presented both he checked the signature and accepted us with a nod. Inside the small metal cube lay a stack of envelopes rubber banded together, and a brochure for the policy company with a sticky note that said change of beneficiary packet inside. And my fingers tingled because this meant someone had been routing notices away from our mailbox. We carried the stack to a counter and flipped through. There were premium notices, a letter that thanked Ernest for updating his beneficiary to Marcus Carter only, and an appointment card for a nurse visit that never happened at our house, and a line that said please be ready with 2 forms of identification at the time of signature, which told me a notary had met someone somewhere that was not our kitchen table. Denise photographed each page while I sorted by date, and the pattern made a shape that anyone with a good heart would hate, a steady funnel of information away from the woman who should have seen it, and a steady increase in pressure toward the man whose patience had defined our years. We took the copies to Harper, and she stacked them with the bank printouts and said we have enough to freeze and to ask for an investigator, and then she looked at me kindly and said, Loretta, I must ask a hard question. Do you want an autopsy order? And I said I do, and I told her I was ready to hold the truth even if it broke what was left of the day. She called the coroner and spoke with the careful urgency of someone carrying a lamp in a wind, and by afternoon we had a tentative yes pending paperwork, and she told me to expect pushback if anyone had already begun a claim. On the porch the sun leaned toward evening and Sister Bernice came by with peach cobbler and eyes that read faces, and she sat and told me she had seen Marcus outside the insurance office 3 times last month, and that he had taken a call on the church steps where he said words I did not like, and she made a face and said forgive me for telling it, but he said we need that payout, and then he saw me and smiled too wide, and I did not sleep right since. I thanked her and squeezed her hand and felt community move into place like a net under a trapeze artist, soft yet strong. And I realized the investigation was no longer only a matter of papers, it was a matter of witnesses and of a town that knows the difference between grief and greed. Before she left she patted my knee and said, child, when a lie is dug in like a weed you do not just cut the top, you pull slow and steady until you have the root, and I told her that was exactly what I planned to do, and I felt the first real piece of hope open inside my chest like a window. That night Denise and I sat at the table and laid out everything like a puzzle, the notebook photos, the bank statements, the post office papers, the letter, the audio file, and we drew a timeline that showed when pressure began and when Ernest felt fog and when he cleared and when he died, and the line threw a shadow straight toward Marcus. I tried to pray without anger, but my voice shook, and then I settled on a different prayer, not for softness but for accuracy. Lord, let me hit the mark. My phone lit with one more instruction, tomorrow evening go to the church meeting. He will speak there, bring copies and do not flinch, and though no name sat at the end of that line, I knew who he meant and I felt the tide turn. I went to bed not as a widow in the first week of ache but as a woman preparing for truth to walk into a room and take off its coat, and before I slept I pressed Ernest's letter under my pillow the way a child presses a talisman, and I whispered I hear you, and a stillness settled that did not feel empty, it felt like company. That evening I packed copies into a folder, whispered a prayer, and told Denise to set an alarm, because tomorrow night at church I would carry this truth into the light and stand steady while the room decided whether to fully believe a mother choosing love and truth. The church hall filled early that evening, folding chairs clicked open, programs rustled like small wings, and the low music from the keyboard drifted across the parquet floor with a kindness that made me ache. I sat near the aisle with Denise beside me and the folder under my palm, and I felt the way a tide feels when the moon is not visible but its pull is certain. The meeting was listed as a neighborhood update on housing and safety, and that gave Marcus a microphone without having to ask, which he has always preferred, a platform you can claim while pretending it was handed to you by duty. Sister Bernice waved from the refreshment table and pointed at a tray of cookies as if sugar might armor my nerves. I smiled and shook my head because I needed clarity more than comfort. Harper arrived in a navy suit that told the room she respected the church and the law in equal measure. She squeezed my shoulder and said quietly, we will let the facts speak, and I nodded and tried to make my breathing match the steady look in her eyes. The pastor opened with prayer, gentle and even, and when he spoke of truth that holds the community together I felt a chord inside me answer. He recognized me in earnest with a few words and I bowed my head. Then the agenda began and the first 2 items were reports about youth programs and a food pantry. The ordinary goodness that keeps a neighborhood alive. Marcus stood when his time came, a clean white shirt, a tie with a quiet pattern, a smile that knows how to reassure an audience, and he thanked the pastor and the board and spoke of opportunity. He praised the church for its service and said he wanted to honor legacy by improving the blocks around it, and people nodded because the language of improvement is sweet when you are tired of neglect. I watched his hands move, open, inviting, and I remembered those same hands as a boy holding frog jars and later holding report cards and later still holding contracts. And a tremor traveled up my arm to my throat because what I was about to do would tear something that used to be safe. But the phone in my purse vibrated with a single pulse and I knew it was time. He shifted to talk of estate planning and how families could avoid confusion, and he slid the word insurance into the air with the ease of a salesman who does not look like one. And he said when my father passed, we handled matters quickly so that my mother could rest, and the room made a sympathetic sound like a low wave. I heard my own name on his tongue and felt a coldness in it, not ice, more like absence, the way a chair remembers a person who has just stood up. Harper gave me a small nod and I rose, holding the folder, and my knees felt reliable. My voice found its footing in the first sentence. Pastor, neighbors, I asked for a minute as a mother and as the wife of the man we laid to rest this week, and the room grew quiet in a way that covers a person rather than exposes them, and I said thank you. Then I turned and looked at my son and said, Marcus, I will say this with care so that truth will not be bruised by anger. He kept the pleasant half-smile of a man confident he can steer any current to his advantage, and he said, of course, Mama, please share. And that word Mama rang wrong in my ear because it was a stage word in that moment and not a home word. I held up a copy of the first page from the blue notebook and said, my husband Ernest kept careful notes in case confusion tried to visit our house, and I read the line where he wrote that the policy numbers were too sweet, and that he had been urged to hurry, and that he had stopped taking pills because they made him cloudy, and you could feel the room lean forward as if scenting something on the wind. Marcus lifted a hand and said gently, now Mama, we do not need to go into private details. The church is not the place, and I answered, the church is exactly the place for truth when family has been used as a blanket to hide cold intentions. Denise touched my elbow and whispered steady, and Harper stepped to the end of the aisle and said in a firm voice that we had notified the insurer to freeze any payout pending review because of irregularities, and a woman in the third row murmured, Lord help. I laid out the bank statements that showed the mailed notices rerouted to a post office box, and Mrs. Thompson from the bank, who had slipped into the back pew, raised her hand and confirmed the change of address had not been customary, and that a phone confirmation from an adult male had completed the process, and the pastor asked if she was comfortable speaking and she nodded and stood and said it with that calm tone tellers use when the math does not care about opinion. Marcus tried a new angle and said he had set up the box only to manage details so his grieving mother would not be burdened, and I said if care was your reason then why did your father write that he felt watched when he said no? And his smile faltered for a breath and then returned as if rebuilt. Harper lifted the flash drive and asked the board for permission to play a short audio file that my late husband recorded because he feared pressure, and the pastor looked at Marcus, and Marcus said this is unnecessary and cruel, and a deacon said softly sometimes a wound must be washed or it will fester. The board agreed and Harper connected the laptop to the projector with a cable that clicked into place like a key finding a lock. The sound came through the speakers a little thin but clear enough that Ernest's voice filled the hall, careful and measured, and he spoke of vitamins that made him slow and of stopping them and feeling clear again. He described a visit where Marcus reached for the tea pitcher and he asked him to wait. He recorded a garage conversation where a son asked too many questions about accidents, and when the recording ended there was a quiet that happens when people are recalculating their map of a person they thought they knew. Marcus said the recording was taken out of context and that he had only wanted his father to prepare for what every family faces, and he moved his hands in that open way again, but the room was not nodding now, it was listening, and listening is a different creature than agreeing. I held up the letter Ernest wrote to me and read the line that said do not let grief make you obedient, ask for an autopsy. And then I looked at Marcus and asked him why he had arranged the funeral so fast, why there had been no discussion of an autopsy, why the policy forms used a notary that never came into our house, and he began to answer and then stopped because he did not like the sound of his own explanation when he tried it on in public. Sister Bernice rose and said in a voice that had rocked many babies that she had seen Marcus outside the insurance office 3 times last month and had overheard him say we need that payout. And she apologized for telling it and said that truth feels heavy but it carries itself if you let it. A man near the back stood and said he had done maintenance at the property where Marcus now held an office and that he had heard a loud argument between father and son about signing, and he bowed his head as if he wished he had knocked on our door sooner. The pastor looked at Marcus again and said, son, you may speak, and Marcus tried to return to the language of duty and care, but his voice had a stiffness now that did not match the words. And when people feel that mismatch they hold their applause. My phone vibrated and I glanced at the screen while keeping my face still and saw a short line that said now, and I nodded to Harper and she played the second clip, the one that had kept me awake because it was not Ernest's voice but my son speaking on the phone to someone we had not yet named, and in it he said she trusts me, let me handle the tea, no one will question, after this we will be straight, and several people gasped and one person cried oh God. And Marcus lunged toward Harper and said that was illegally recorded and that it proved nothing about intent. But the room had decided to hear the content before it debated the rules. Denise stood then, she faced her brother, and she said, Marcus, look at our mother, and he did not, he looked at the floor. And she said we were raised to read every word before we sign and to speak truth even if your voice shakes. And mine is shaking, but I am speaking, and I will not help you hide behind our family name. The pastor stepped between us and asked everyone to sit and breathe and remember that anger can set a fire that burns the house, but truth can light a lamp that saves it. And he asked me if I had anything else to present, and I said yes, then held up the letter from the insurer that confirmed the change of beneficiary to Marcus only, effective 2 weeks before my husband died. And the gas that moved through the room felt like a strong wind. Marcus tried one last path. He said, Mama, you are hurting and people are putting ideas in your head. He said you have been through so much and you should not be dragged through public embarrassment. And he looked toward the pastor for help, and the pastor looked back at him with a face that had married people and buried them and held their secrets in their hands and said, Son, embarrassment is a small price when justice is the goal. A police officer who had come for the neighborhood update moved toward the side aisle and spoke quietly into a radio. Harper nodded to him and passed copies of the documents, and I felt the strangest mix of sorrow and relief, like standing in a doorway watching a storm sweep the yard clean of debris even as it cracks the branches of a tree you planted. Marcus said, I will not let you do this, and took a step toward the table, and I lifted my hand palm out, not to stop him but to steady myself, and I said the line that had been burning a path through my chest since the graveside. You closed your father's coffin with your own hands, son, but today truth closes the lid on your lies. And the words hung there and then settled into the room like a bell tone that finds every corner. The officer asked Marcus to sit and he did not. He said he needed air, and he moved toward the door, and 2 more officers who had been in the lobby stepped in. And for a strangled moment I saw the boy who used to run wind sprints at the park and laugh when he beat the older kids. And my mouth filled with salt because a mother does not stop seeing the child inside a man even when the man has done something that kidnaps him from her. Harper spoke quietly to the officers and handed them a list of case numbers and contacts and the flash drive. And the pastor prayed aloud for courage and patience and for a hand to hold each of us steady while the earth shifted. And the keyboardist began to play softly, not a hymn, not quite, more like a simple line of notes that reminded us we were not only minds but hearts and bodies in a room together. Marcus turned to me and said, Mama, this is all a mistake. Please call them off. And there was a tremor in his voice that I recognized from fevers and bad dreams long ago. And I said, I cannot call off what the truth has already begun. I can only stand in it and trust that what is right will prevail. And he swallowed hard and looked at Denise and said, Help me. And she shook her head with tears and said, I am helping you by not letting you drag us deeper into this. The officers asked him to come with them to answer questions, and he said he would call his attorney, and they said he could do that at the station, and he looked one last time at me and I nodded, not in approval, not in triumph, but in the solemn agreement between 2 people who understand that a path has reached its unavoidable turn. As he was led away, someone in the back started to clap and the pastor raised his hand and said, not applause, prayer, and the room bowed, and I bowed with it and felt a release under my ribs that did not feel like victory. It felt like a burden being set down in the only place it could be carried without breaking me. After the officers left, Harper asked if I wanted to address the room or go home, and I said I would speak, because when a wound is opened in public by necessity, it should be salved in public by intention. I stepped to the microphone and said, my voice may shake but my mind is clear. I love my son and I loved my husband, and that is why I have done this, because love without truth is a kind of neglect that dresses itself as kindness, and I will not neglect the dead or the living. And the room murmured amen, not loud, just steady. I told them that grief and fear can make a person obedient to the wrong shepherd. And I told them to read every line and to pause before they sign, to ask who benefits and when, to watch the tea and to trust the alarms the body gives when the spirit is uneasy. And I thanked them for being my witnesses so that the story would not be one person's word against another, but a community choosing light. Denise took my hand and squeezed, and Sister Bernice slipped a tissue into my other palm and whispered that I had done a hard holy thing. And I believed her because my knees finally began to shake now that the moment had passed. And that is how a body tells the truth too, by trembling after it holds still for longer than it thought possible. In the quiet that followed, I felt the phone in my purse vibrate again, and when I looked, the message was simple and soft in its way. Thank you. And I closed my eyes and let a slow breath empty me of all the words that could not help now. We left the church by the side door so that the reporters who had heard scanners and gathered near the front would not turn our faces into tonight entertainment. Harper promised to meet us at the station later, and Denise drove, both hands on the wheel, both eyes wet but bright. At home I sat in Ernest's chair and let the room settle around me, and for a while all I heard was the clock counting the seconds like steps down a long hall, and then I heard a car door outside and the low talk of neighbors who could not sleep and had come to check that I was not alone. And I was not, because the house held me and the truth had begun to hold the house. I leaned my head back and let my mouth form the words thank you without sound, and in that small private moment the weight I had carried since the coffin clicked eased, not gone, not even light, but easier to move with, the way a shoulder learns a new balance after a load shifts. I thought of Marcus as a boy and then as a man and then as a person who will have to answer to facts in a room that does not care for charm, and I prayed not for his comfort, but for his surrender to what is real, because that is the only road back from this kind of wrong. Then I folded my hands over Ernest's letter and told him quietly that I had done as he asked, and that I was tired and also awake in a way that did not feel like fear, and that I would keep going because the truth had asked me to, and when truth asks, the answer is yes. The night after the meeting the air around the house felt different, as if every wall had exhaled the secret it had been holding. I did not sleep. I sat in Ernest's chair and watched the blue light of dawn creep through the blinds until the color of the sky changed from iron to silver. The truth was out, but exposure is not the same as justice. I knew that from life and from church. The gossip would move fast, the story would twist, and there would be people who would try to soften what Marcus had done because they once saw him carrying him books or giving a tithe. Real justice requires patience, and patience requires a plan. Harper called at 8 sharp and said the police wanted a formal statement, that the district attorney had been notified, and that the insurance company had placed a freeze. I thanked her, then asked a question that surprised even me: can I attend his arraignment? And she said yes if you are ready. Ready was a strange word. I was not angry, not shaking. I was steady in the way water is steady when it has frozen over. By afternoon the house filled with visitors, casseroles and condolences again. Only now their eyes carried curiosity mixed with pity. Sister Bernice stood guard like an usher, steering gossipers away with her church smile, and when the last plate was covered with foil she turned to me and said, "Child, you can rest. The Lord has moved," but I shook my head. The Lord moves through willing hands. I went to the study, opened the notebook again and read the last pages. Ernest had written a line that now felt prophetic. Truth must not only be spoken, it must be documented until it cannot be denied. That was my next step. I gathered every record into labeled envelopes, wrote a timeline, printed the transcripts Harper had made, and made 3 sets. One for the police, one for Harper, one for myself. Revenge was not my aim, clarity was. But clarity in this world sometimes looks like revenge to those who profit from confusion. Denise arrived that evening with new information. Her friend at the legal aid office had overheard a rumor that Marcus was telling people he had been framed by his mother's grief, and by outsiders hungry for money. I told her lies spread like smoke, and that the only way to handle smoke is to open all the windows and let the wind work. Harper called later and said there would be a hearing to decide on the release of insurance funds, and that media might show up. She asked if I wanted to speak. I said I would, because silence after exposure lets weeds regrow. She warned me to keep my tone calm and factual, and I said my tone has learned calmness the hard way. The next morning I dressed in Ernest's favorite color, navy, and pinned his old Union badge to my coat. Denise drove me downtown. The courthouse sat heavy and gray against a sky that promised rain, and the marble steps felt too wide for an old woman walking into battle. Reporters waited outside, cameras ready. One shouted questions and I said only justice has its own schedule. Inside, the air was cold enough to keep tempers from rising. Marcus was brought in wearing county gray, and for one trembling instant I saw the boy he had been, hair sticking up after baseball practice, begging for water. Then I remembered the tea pitcher. Harper whispered, "Just breathe." When the judge entered, everyone stood, and the clatter of chairs sounded like a wave of penance. The prosecutor laid out the evidence, audio files, forged signatures, bank changes, the letter, and a toxicology report that had returned with traces of an unprescribed sedative in Ernest's system. A murmur went through the gallery. Marcus kept his head down. Harper had prepared a short statement for me to read if allowed, and the judge nodded when she requested it. I walked to the stand, the paper trembling only slightly, and I read, "I am not here out of anger but out of duty. My husband was a man of faith and honesty." He wrote, "Do not let grief make you obedient. I am simply following that instruction." When I sat, the judge thanked me for my dignity, and that word dignity wrapped around me like a shawl. The hearing ended with the judge ordering a full investigation into possible fraud and tampering. The insurance representative confirmed that payout was suspended pending criminal review. Outside, cameras flashed, and Harper shielded me with her arm. A reporter asked, "Do you forgive your son?" I said forgiveness is between the soul and God. Accountability is between a man and the law. The quote ended up in the paper the next day, and it started conversations all over the community. Within a week, church members began to rally around the message of reading fine print and protecting elders from manipulation. A local radio host invited me to speak about it. I hesitated until Denise said, "Mama, sometimes telling your story is the best protection for others." I prayed on it overnight, and by morning I agreed. The broadcast aired on a Thursday. I spoke plainly, no theatrics, no tears, just the story of how love can be used as a weapon when people forget to honor it. The host asked what message I wanted to leave, and I said, "When something feels wrong, believe your spirit even if your family tells you not to." The interview spread faster than I expected. Women from neighboring churches sent letters. Some said they had felt pressured into signing documents they did not understand. Harper helped me organize those stories into a report for the State Elder Protection Board. Revenge had turned into reform, and that, I realized, was the truest form of justice. Then came the call from the detective. They had found the notary who witnessed the forged signature. Under questioning, he admitted Marcus had brought pre-signed papers and claimed his father was ill and could not leave home. The detective asked if I wanted to testify at the trial. I said yes because the truth should hear its own echo. The trial date was set for late spring. In the months leading up to it, my house became both sanctuary and war room. Harper visited often. She taught me how to keep records, how to stay composed under questioning, how to let silence do the talking when the other side grows desperate. Denise cooked for us, her presence the kind of comfort that does not distract from purpose. I found strength in the ordinary things. Folding laundry, watering plants, polishing earnest tools. Every small act reminded me that life continues even when justice moves slowly. The day of the trial, the courthouse was full again. Marcus' lawyers tried to paint him as overwhelmed by grief, manipulated by financial stress. The prosecutor countered with evidence that he had transferred funds from Ernest's account to his own 2 days before the death. When the recording played, the jurors leaned forward. I could see the moment recognition crossed their faces, the tone of a man planning, not mourning. When I took the stand again, I looked straight at Marcus and said, "You are my son, and I love you enough to tell the truth about you." My voice did not waver. The prosecutor asked what I wanted from the court, and I said, "I want acknowledgement that a good man was betrayed and that other families may learn to guard their doors more carefully." After closing arguments, the jury deliberated for 6 hours. I spent that time walking the courthouse corridors, praying without words. When they returned, the foreman read the verdict. Guilty on counts of fraud and manslaughter. Marcus closed his eyes and lowered his head. I felt neither triumph nor relief, only gravity, the kind that keeps you upright when you might otherwise float away from pain. News spread again, faster this time. The same station that had once played our hymns ran a segment titled, "The Widow Who Fought Back." Strangers sent cards and small donations. Harper suggested creating a fund to educate seniors about financial safety. We called it the Ernest Carter Foundation. The first meeting was held in the church hall where the confrontation had taken place. The pastor opened in prayer, thanking God for bringing light to hidden corners, and then turned the microphone to me. I said, "Some people call what happened revenge. I call it stewardship. My husband built his life on protecting the weak and repairing what was broken. When I fought for truth, I was only continuing his work." The audience nodded, some cried, some took notes. Denise filmed the talk for our foundation's small website. In the following weeks, I received letters from women as far as Mississippi and North Carolina. One wrote, "Your story reminded me to check my mother's paperwork, and we found a false signature too." I realized that revenge, when purified by purpose, can become rescue for others. Still, there were nights when I sat on the porch and let tears come for the boy who used to bring me wildflowers from the ditch. Sister Bernice would walk by, wave her flashlight and call, "Keep your light on, Loretta, you're teaching us all." And I would answer, "Trying, sister, just trying." One afternoon, Harper brought official letters, restitution from the frozen insurance payout, funds for Ernest's estate, and a note from the district attorney acknowledging my cooperation. I placed those documents in the blue notebook and wrote at the bottom of the last page, "Justice rendered. Case closed." Then I closed the cover and tied the rubber band around it one final time. The public exposure had rippled through the community. Church sermons spoke about integrity. Local banks started hosting free literacy workshops. The radio host called again and said, "You've become the voice of quiet justice." I laughed softly and said, "I'm just a woman who learned to listen when truth whispers." In May, when azaleas bloomed, the pastor invited me to speak on Mother's Day. I stood at the pulpit in a yellow dress Denise bought for me and said, "Motherhood is not just loving your children when they do right. It's loving them enough to stop them when they do wrong." The congregation stood and applauded, not for me, but for the courage that lives in all of us when we decide fear will not have the final word. That night on the porch I looked at the stars and whispered to Ernest, "It's done." The wind carried the faint scent of his old cologne from the closet where his jacket still hung, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt rest come, not as sleep but as peace. The revenge the world saw had been nothing more than the truth insisting on daylight. I smiled at that thought, and when my phone buzzed again, one soft vibration, I opened it and saw a single word glowing on the screen: peace. The days after the verdict fell into a quiet that sounded almost like snowfall, not because the air was kind, but because everything that had been shouting finally ran out of breath. I woke before dawn and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that tasted like resolve and memory. The house was strangely orderly, as if truth had come through with a broom and dustpan and cleared the corners. I did not feel triumph. I felt gravity. Some mornings I pressed Ernest's badge against my palm until the cool metal steadied me, and I whispered the simple sentence that had kept me upright since the funeral: "Do not let grief make you obedient." When I looked in the mirror, the woman looking back had the same eyes, but they carried a knowledge I would never have chosen. The community tried to hold me. People stopped by with chicken and greens, with pies and cards, with hands that lingered on my shoulder. Their love helped. So did their silence when they had no words. At church, the pastor asked me to stand while he prayed not for vengeance, but for healing in layers, for bones and hearts and history. The congregation answered amen with a tone that respected sorrow, and did not mistake justice for joy. After service, a group of deacons told me the building would host monthly workshops with our foundation for seniors who wanted to learn how to read contracts and protect their savings. In their faces I saw the first fruits of this hard harvest. Denise became my steady ground. She checked the mail, cooked stew, laughed when laughter came, and did not try to fix what could only be carried. Some afternoons she brought her sewing to the porch and we worked in companionable quiet while the sun shifted across the fence. Sometimes we spoke of Marcus. We did not pretend he had never been our joy. We did not pretend he had not become danger. Love is not a trick mirror. It is a clear window, and we stood at it together and looked at everything. The district attorney called to say sentencing would be in 6 weeks. He asked if I wanted the court to hear a victim statement. I said yes, and I wrote drafts that sounded too hard and then drafts that sounded too soft until at last the words fit like a good shoe. On the day of sentencing, I sat in the second row with Harper and Denise flanking me like bookends. Marcus entered in the same county gray. He kept his head down. When the judge asked if I wished to speak, I rose and read slowly. I said Ernest was a decent man whose life taught our children the value of showing up and telling the truth. I said harm had been done not only to a body but to the trust of a family and a neighborhood. I said accountability does not erase love. It protects the living from further harm. The judge nodded and thanked me for my clarity. Then he pronounced the sentence. Years that would carry my son far past the age of easy beginnings. A sound rose from my chest that was not a sob and not a sigh, something older than both. I sat. Harper touched my wrist. Denise pressed a tissue into my hand. When the courtroom emptied, a woman I did not know stopped me and said my mother almost lost her house to a nephew who kept bringing papers he would not let her read. We listened to your radio interview and we checked every line. You probably saved her roof. I thanked her and walked to the steps. And on those cold stones I learned that sometimes consequence and service arrive in the same hour. The prison sent instructions for visiting. I paced the living room with the letter in my hand. The page was simple and practical, full of rules about time and clothing and what you can carry. I could not decide if going would be mercy or harm. Sister Bernice found me at the kitchen sink that evening and said, "Honey, forgiveness is a door with 2 locks. God has a key and you have a key. You can turn yours whenever you are ready. Do not let anyone force your hand." That night I dreamed of the garage the way it looked before chaos. Ernest's tools lined up like a choir. The light gentle, the floor swept. When I woke I set a small vase of flowers on his workbench and told him I would visit our son when my spirit had something to give besides salt. The autopsy report arrived. There were traces of a sedative in Ernest's blood that did not belong to him. Seeing it in ink took my breath again. Yet it also lifted a weight. My fear had not made up a storm. A storm had been named. I filed the report under a tab called Truth, and let the drawer close with a careful click. A week later the church held a second memorial for Ernest. Not a funeral, but a service of grateful remembrance. The choir sang his favorite hymn. The pastor spoke about honest labor and a tender heart. I told a story about the winter the roof leaked, and how Ernest had set pots under the drip and told jokes until laughter outpaced the water. The congregation laughed and then grew quiet the way people do when memory finishes its work and peace begins. After the benediction I stood by the door and shook hands like a greeter. People said he would be proud. I said I believed so. On the porch that night I opened letters from around the state. Some were written in a tremor hand. Some on lined paper torn from notebooks. One woman described the ache of divorcing a man who gambled away her pension. Another told me her son had borrowed money and never paid it back and she was ashamed to say no until the day she finally did. They did not need answers. They needed someone to say you are not alone. I wrote back to as many as I could. I told them that boundaries are not betrayal. They are care. The foundation began to grow in the most ordinary ways. A retired banker came to teach about interest and fees. A nurse spoke about medication safety. A young man who learned from his own mistakes told the truth about loans that look like lifelines and turn into chains. I watched a circle of elders compare notes about phone scams and fake charities. The room hummed with intelligence that had been underestimated for too long. The aftershocks in my own life came quietly. I found a photograph of Marcus at 12, gap-toothed, holding a fish he and Ernest had caught at the lake. I clutched it to my chest and cried for the boy who vanished into a man who could not remember his own good lessons. I called the prison chaplain and asked if my son had someone to talk to. The chaplain said he meets weekly with men who want to tell the truth. I said tell him his mama is praying for courage to face what is real. One afternoon I ran into the notary at a grocery store. He looked smaller in daylight. He tried to avoid me and then turned and muttered an apology. I told him apologies are a beginning. The rest is repair. He nodded and said he had given a full statement and accepted charges for his part. I walked away and felt a small loosening in the knot behind my shoulder. Denise and I took a day trip to the coast the first warm Saturday in April. We watched pelicans slide low over the water like careful handwriting. I let the wind comb my hair. On the drive back she asked if I had forgiven Marcus. I said I had loosened my grip on anger, but forgiveness is not a magic trick. It is a daily decision that needs truth in order to stand. Some days I could turn the key a fraction. Some days I could not. She squeezed my hand and said that was honest and enough. At home I turned Ernest's garage into a quiet room for reading and counsel. A card table held brochures for the foundation. A pot of mint grew by the door. I kept the blue notebook in the desk, not as an altar to pain, but as a testimonial that clarity can be made from ink and patience. I learned to rest again, not all at once but in small pockets. A nap in the afternoon sun. A hymn hummed while folding towels. A phone call with a cousin who told a story that made me laugh so hard my ribs ached. Grief softened its edges and stepped back enough for ordinary days to find me. When a new widow at church asked how you do it, I told her there is no trick, only 3 small practices. Speak the truth when it is time. Let people bring you beans and bread. Walk to the mailbox with your head up even when you feel bent. In late spring I wrote a letter to Marcus. I told him I would visit when he was ready to speak without lies. I said I loved the boy he had been and that I would not pretend the man had not done harm. I said I hoped his soul would learn to tell the truth because that is how anyone begins again. I mailed it and felt a calm unlike any other. The calm of a woman who has said what needed saying and then set it down. On a quiet evening in May, as the sun folded itself behind the pecan tree, my phone buzzed once on the table. I lifted it with a smile that surprised me, and the screen showed a calendar reminder I had set without thinking. It was time to water the garden. I took the hose and stood by the azaleas. Water arced in the last light and the petals looked like small cups catching grace. I said out loud to the breeze, we made it through, earnest, not untouched but unbroken. Then I went inside and wrote one more line in the notebook on a blank page I had left there for this very purpose. Truth did not save us from pain. It saved us from staying lost. Spring settled over the city like a soft quilt and I felt the house take a deeper breath than it had in a long while. One morning I opened the garage door and the smell of cedar and old oil rose like a small resurrection, and I said out loud, this room will not carry sorrow only, it will carry purpose. I swept the floor until the dust looked like fog rolling away from a riverbank. I washed the windows until light came in clear. I set a small card table in the corner and a vase of mint near the door, and I pinned Ernest Union badge above the desk like a quiet star. The Truth Winds Foundation began not with a ribbon but with folding chairs and a pot of coffee. Sister Bernice placed a sign on the porch that said free help for seniors today. Harper walked in with a stack of forms and a steady smile, and Denise brought a lemon pound cake that made the room smell like mercy. People arrived in 2s and 4s, some with canes, some with notebooks, all with stories that needed daylight, and we listened and wrote and called banks and read contracts line by line until the ink gave up its tricks. I learned to watch faces for the moment understanding lands, the tiny nod that says I am no longer afraid of this paper, I can carry it, and each time I saw that nod I felt a stitch tighten in the torn place inside me. I still visited the graveside on Sundays with fresh-cut flowers from the small garden I planted along the fence, marigolds for courage, rosemary for remembrance, and I told Ernest about the workshop where a retired banker explained interest like a neighbor explaining how to prune a rose. I told him about the afternoon a nurse taught us to list every pill by name and keep the list in the freezer for paramedics. I told him about the young man who stood in front of us and said I sold people loans to it hurt them and I am here to tell you how to say no to men like me. And how the room went quiet and then filled with questions and then with forgiveness of the firm kind that refuses to excuse but chooses to believe in change. Life did not become sweet just because justice had done its work. There were mornings when grief knocked at the back door with its old tin cup and asked for one more measure of attention, and I learned to give it a sip and then send it on its way. Some nights I sat on the porch and felt the tug to call the prison and ask for a visit, and some nights I did not. I told myself the truth has its own clock and I will not hurry it or make it wait for me longer than necessary. One afternoon I found a letter in the mailbox with Marcus' handwriting on the front and a stillness moved through me like a cloud passing over water. I took it inside and sat at the kitchen table and opened it. He wrote, Mama, I do not know how to say sorry big enough to fit what I did. I wake at night and hear the lid of the coffin and the word help me. It is my voice now, not his, and I am the one who needs help. I do not ask you to forgive me because I do not know how to carry that gift yet. I ask you to let me tell the whole truth when you come. And then he wrote a list of names and a timeline and details the prosecutor had already proved. Yet reading it in his hand shook something loose in me that court documents could not touch. I called the chaplain and asked for a visiting day. He said Sunday afternoon would be quiet. Bring your identification and wear plain clothes, nothing metal, no food or gifts, only yourself. And I said I will bring a prayer if that is allowed, and he laughed and said prayers pass every gate. On the drive there Denise held the wheel like she was carrying water across a room without spilling. She asked if I wanted her to come in and I said I need to walk this first stretch alone. She nodded and parked and let her hand rest on my arm for 3 breaths. The entry process was a series of doors and checks and metal detectors and a cold bench where time seemed to hold its breath. And then I was in a room with round tables and bolted chairs and a ceiling that hummed like a refrigerator. And I saw my son at the far end, thinner, eyes older, hands folded, the same cowlick from childhood defying confinement. He stood when he saw me and did not reach because the rules would not let him, and maybe because he did not trust himself. We sat and the first words were clumsy and then honest. He said, Mama, I lied to myself so well I thought I could lie to you and to God. And I said the only lies that work are the ones we agree to keep. And I told him I was done agreeing with anything that harms my house. And he cried without hiding, and I did not rush to hush him because some sounds need to be heard all the way to the last note. He told me the debts had started small and grown like vines. He told me the fear of failure had been louder than his memory of Ernest's voice. He told me about the day he held the tea pitcher and heard two voices, one saying do it and one saying stop, and that he chose the wrong one, and that the choosing had gotten easier with every small wrong that went unchallenged. And I said the heart can be trained back to truth, but it takes repetition and humility and time. When the guard signaled 5 minutes left, he asked if I could forgive him now, and I said forgiveness is not a switch, son, it is a practice. I can begin again today, and I can begin again tomorrow, and I will, and your part is to tell the truth every time that door opens, even if all you are saying is the same sentence from yesterday. And he nodded like a man who has finally found the edge of a path he can trust. I left with a calm that was not relief and not release. It was the peace of doing the next right thing and letting it be enough for one day. The foundation grew in simple circles: a workshop at the church, a talk at the community center, a table at the senior fair with a hand-painted banner where we gave out folders and pens and checklists, and a card that read 3 small practices for your peace: read every line, ask who benefits and when, keep a trusted witness at the table. Local banks called and offered space for monthly classes. A credit union asked me to record a message to play in their lobby about elder safety. The radio host invited me back, and I told the same story in the same steady tone because repetition builds a fence where one telling is only a rope. One evening the pastor stopped by with a cardboard box filled with returned offering envelopes and said, there are notes in here we thought you should see. Inside were letters from people across town and across the county. A retired teacher who had closed a line of credit she did not remember opening. A deacon who caught a contractor adding hidden fees. A widow who brought her granddaughter to a workshop and called it the first useful conversation they had had in months. I spread the notes out on the table and realized my kitchen had become a map of survival. I began writing a small guide with Harper, plain language, short chapters, stories that felt like sitting on a porch while the truth put its feet up and stayed a while. We called it Hold Your Pen, and we printed it cheaply and gave it away in stacks. The cover showed a pair of hands, one older and one younger, holding the same pen together because I wanted the image to say what my mouth keeps saying: protect does not mean control, it means stand side by side. Time softened the edges around the photographs in the hallway, the image of Ernest at the picnic with sun in his eyes, the frame with Marcus and Denise holding sparklers on a 4th of July that smells like watermelon and citronella in my memory. I could look at those frames without flinching. I could say we were happy there without regret swallowing the sentence. I could say we are different now without bitterness writing the next line. I kept watering the garden, marigolds bright as small suns, collards steady in their row, tomatoes stubborn and generous by turns, and while I worked the soil I found a rhythm for prayer that did not need many words. Thank you for breath. Thank you for bread. Thank you for work. Keep me honest, keep me humble, let me help. In late summer the church held a community justice day and invited us to set up stations on the lawn. Children ran between tables with flyers like kites, and old men argued kindly about baseball while waiting for the next talk. I spoke at noon under a pop-up canopy that snapped in the breeze. I wore a navy dress and a straw hat, and I told the crowd that my story is not about punishment. It is about a house that refused to fall when somebody tried to pull out its beams. I said we can love our kin and still lock our doors. We can pray for sinners and still testify to their deeds. We can start over and still remember what hurt us. So we do not walk back into it blind. The applause that followed was not loud, it was long, the kind that feels like a hand on your back as you climb a hill. The district attorney stopped by afterward and said the state would like to partner on a public awareness campaign. Would I lend my voice? And I said yes, if the materials respect the intelligence of my elders and the dignity of our communities. He said that is the only way it will work. And for once I believed a public promise because I had a seat at the table and a folder of edits in my bag. Autumn arrived with its honest air and I felt a pull to visit Marcus again. I called the chaplain and he said he had been attending a small circle of men who chose not to lie for 30 days and that my son had kept the practice. I smiled and said, tell him I am on my way. And when I sat across from him he looked steadier and more ordinary, and I realized ordinary is the goal after catastrophe. Not spectacle, not sainthood, just a day made of honest tasks lined end to end. He spoke about a program that lets inmates tutor for a credential. He said he wanted to help when he could. I said help begins with finishing what you broke. He said I know. He asked about Denise. I told him she was well and that she came to the house most Sundays and that we kept a plate for him on the table anyway because our love is stubborn. And the smile that crossed his face looked like the boy at the lake holding a fish with both hands as if it were a gospel. We ended with a prayer he asked to lead and he said, God, I do not ask to be spared consequence. I asked to be spared from the man I was, and I said amen because sometimes the best prayer is the one that fits in a single breath. On the first cold night of the year I lit a candle in the study and opened the blue notebook to a clean page and wrote a new list, not of wrongs but of new ways to live. Guard the tea, read the lines, keep a witness, pause before you sign, check the mailbox, honor the alarm in your spirit, accept help without shame, give help without pride, forgive in installments, tell the truth completely. And then I closed the book and tucked it away because lists are only useful if you live them. The foundation received a small grant and we hired a part-time coordinator, a young woman named Alana with a sharp eye for paperwork and a soft voice for elders. She reminded me of Denise at that age, serious and kind, and the day she found a clause that would have trapped a widow into fees she could not pay, I felt the old swell of pride and thought Ernest would have clapped his big hands and said, "Look at that mind at work." Winter came and with it a calm deeper than any I had known since the first coffin click. I woke on a Sunday and realized I was not bracing myself. I was simply breathing and brewing coffee and choosing a dress and thinking about the hymn I hoped the choir would sing. That was the day I knew rebirth does not announce itself with trumpets. It arrives in the ordinary and sits down at your table as if it has always lived there. Near Christmas the pastor asked me to light the candle of hope during Advent. I walked to the front holding the small taper and I spoke the words printed in the bulletin and then added one of my own. Hope is not a wish, it is a discipline. And if you practice it long enough it becomes muscle memory of the soul. The congregation murmured and I felt the truth of it settle inside me like a log laid on a steady fire. On New Year's Eve I stood on the porch at midnight and listened to fireworks pop over the neighborhood. And I said into the cold bright air, I am still here and I am not afraid. And the answer I felt was not a text and not a voice. It was the warmth in my own chest that comes when a person has kept her word to herself. One last thing remained, a promise I made to the folks who listened to me tell this story. The gentle invitation at the end, so I will keep it now. Dear ones, did you walk with me through the storm and into this quiet? Did the truth ring in your bones the way it did in mine? Tell me where you are listening from and tell me the line you will write at the top of your own blue notebook. And if you found strength here, share it with someone you love, because a light grows when you carry it forward. I will be on the porch most evenings with tea brewed by my own hand and lemon sliced by my own knife and a chair waiting for the next neighbor who needs a place to sit while we read a paper and a life together. And when I close my eyes before sleep, I will say the final practice I learned. Truth did not make my past gentle. Truth made my future possible. And I will wake to the sound of ordinary morning, pleased to belong to it again.